Grace and peace to you. For a few weeks, you may recall, we're exploring the faith life of some heroes of mine, hoping that in tracking another person's spiritual journey, we ourselves might be helped along our way. We're humble in this because we can never really know another's faith. Yours is your private matter between you and God. Still, people do act or speak out of their faith or their struggles with it, from which we may deduce tentatively something of their beliefs, surely. Today, I invite you to glance with me at a man not as famous as he should be, and whose lack of fame is a consequence of his faith, Desiderius Erasmus. I know of him partly because he studied at Queen's College, Cambridge, as I did, and as you doubtless noticed, I've got a Queen's College tie on. Of course, he studied there generations earlier than I, arriving in 1505, when England's king was Henry VIII, who was friendly to him at first. Desiderius and his brother were the illegitimate sons of a Rotterdam priest, so both were smuggled off to be raised and educated in a monastery. Back then, a boy without wealth or influence would have to be very bright to receive good teaching. Desiderius was brilliant, but his brother wasn't, so we don't hear of him again, which means I can stop saying Desiderius and call our man what history names him, Erasmus. In the monastery, not only was his academic brilliance honed, but he became appropriately a Christian and perhaps inappropriately a wit. So our quest will be to trace how his faith, intellect, and wit shaped the course of his life, and even the life of some countries. For in adulthood, Erasmus gradually became recognized as one of Europe's outstanding intellectuals, and one of his main concerns became the blatant corruption, as he saw it, of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, that is. It was a time when popes were known to father children and get them positions of wealth. It was said that Rome's main industry, besides wine, was prostitution. A main source of the church's income was selling indulgences, purported to forgive sins. Not only was the church morally suspect, but with the universities was intellectually flabby. Erasmus took them both on, writing of them, their brains are the most addled, their wits the dullest, characters the least attractive, lives the most hypocritical, talk the most slanderous, and hearts the blackest on earth. So he devoted himself to the church's reform and return to Christ. One way he hoped to help this was by making available to both clergy and laity the truth about Christ by providing them with an accurate translation of the New Testament. Hitherto, only the priests had access to what were at the time quite inexact Latin scriptures, and even these they kept private, feeding to their congregants only what bits and with what interpretation they chose. But Erasmus affirmed, I would have women read the Gospels and epistles, have the plowman and the craftsman sing them at work, the traveler recite them to forget the weariness of his journey. True theology is possessed by every man who has the Spirit of Christ, be he digger or weaver. The New Testament he translated was based on reliable, recently discovered manuscripts and was startlingly good, such that people could truly learn what Christ said and did. And in 1505, he came to England, to, as I said, Queen's College, Cambridge. One of the friends he made was Sir Thomas More, King Henry's Chancellor, who was of like mind, faith, and sense of humor. Encouraged by the latter, Erasmus wrote in Latin what would become a famous satire in praise of folly. It purported to be written by Idiocy, who was a child had been raised by two nurses, intemperance and ignorance. Idiocy celebrated the corruptions and beastliness of the church in such a comic way as to get under the skin of those it clearly portrayed. The book was a great success, except in the church. A personal tidbit here. When I was at Queen's, my rooms were number A2. That is, it was probably built in the oldest part of the college, around 1448, next to the old entrance tower. In 1970, I visited the college for the first time since the 1940s, and the old porter, back then a young porter, said on seeing me, "Sir, I'm sorry I don't recall your name, but I do remember you were in A2. He'd no idea, of course, what rooms Erasmus occupied, but it had to have been part of the old buildings, my part. If so, what if a morsel of Erasmus's breath hung around long enough to get into my lungs? Gad, Zooks, as they used to say, what a privilege." At Queen's, he completed, among other works, a fine dictionary and adagia, a collection of proverbs, a superb book on Christian ethics, Education of a Christian Prince, in which he took on Machiavelli, whose book, The Prince, published 3 years earlier, maintained it is better for a ruler to be feared than loved. Erasmus made the opposite case strongly. A Christian leader should be loved, not feared. He wrote too a handbook of a Christian knight, usually called by the Greek word enchiridion, affirming as central in a life of faith is that Christians should base their lives on Jesus' way of love and generosity, rather than just performing the church's rites and observances. His books and teachings made him deeply admired across Europe, except by the church, becoming tutor to the King of Scotland and friend to many nobility, especially of Charles V, who became Holy Roman Emperor. So when he returned to the Netherlands, he was widely recognized as an eminent, brilliant, humane Christian. And then in 1517, Martin Luther pinned his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. And everything changed for Erasmus. He agreed with some of Luther's criticisms of the church. He'd voiced some himself. But Luther's extremism, autocratic leadership, rigid dogmatism, and refusal to hear others' views worried Erasmus that they'd lead to schism, because he believed that the church, for all its corruption and error, was a vital institution, the heart of European civilization, and reason demanded its reform. His prayer was that if the church opened itself to correction, he'd help it. But his worst fears were realized. The church chose as leaders fervent reactionaries, So it was extremists on both sides who, as he dreaded, divided the church into Protestants and Catholics. At first, both sides tried to enlist him as their ally. After all, he agreed with some of what each side argued for. But he chose what he called the middle way, being ready to discuss, try to see others' point of view, and if fairness suggested compromise could avoid a breakdown of peace, to accept it. When he wouldn't support either side, but advocated this middle way, both sides turned on him as a coward, a betrayer, a backstabber. Luther called him a vainglorious beast and a reptile, an instrument of Satan. Rome portrayed him as even worse than Luther, indeed as the inspirer of Luther. As one opponent put it, Erasmus laid the eggs, Luther hatched them, but God grant that we may stifle the chicks. Rome prohibited use of his books, and it was an edict which was recanted only in 1966. Tragically, too, and as Erasmus had feared, the split of Protestants from Catholics did lead in 1524 to outright war. Politics rather than principle sparked it, as for instance, and strangely, Luther sided with the nobles, and over 100,000 poorly led, poorly armed peasants were massacred. Often thereafter, for decades, religious division would turn violent. In the early 1600s, for example, these religious controversies broke out into the 30 Years' War, in which about a third of the German population was killed. As for Erasmus, he and his middle way were generally held in disgust. His tragedy was that his was a time when reactionaries ruled, when the blessing of moderation, of seeking a middle way, was smothered by extremists. He retired to a life of oblivion in Basel, and eventually to a death almost unobserved. But ideals are hard to wipe out. Here and there, gradually, there are again now, Christians who value his middle way. On the Catholic side, his teachings are valued by many Jesuits. Ignatius of Loyola put them in his spiritual disciplines, and Pope Paul III led a significant counter-reformation, stimulated by the Council of Trent in 1545. On the Protestant side, too, a more moderate climate survives, especially in Britain, where the Anglican Church, which is Protestant, is proud to believe everything in moderation. The European Union recently set up a student exchange program named for Erasmus, and Toronto University has published 89 volumes of his works. Erasmus University in Rotterdam is highly regarded across the world. As for Erasmus himself, he's now recognized by many as the Prince of the Humanists in Northern Europeans' Renaissance, emphasized moderation, excellent education for all, and a return to the simple Christianity of the Gospels. This recognition was late in coming, but is now held by most Christian historians. As for me, here is Jesus' teaching that so perfectly fits Erasmus, and which, if it was sincerely held by all Jesus' followers, would be a wondrous blessing for humanity. It's John chapter 13, verses 34 to 35. Jesus said, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I've loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And by this, surely, everyone will be blessed.